Welcome to the Sleeping Barber podcast.
Do marketing fundamentals matter? Can culture be a catalyst for brand building? Is all market research valuable? Today we have Carol Shmygol joining us, sharing 35 years of wisdom from her time on both the brand and agency side. Sit back and enjoy the show. You're going to love this.
Welcome to the Sleeping Barber podcast, a place for business leaders to get the best and most credible information on marketing, strategy, and innovation. Your hosts, Marc Binkley and Vasilis Douros, share their experiences as they gather insights from the world's leading experts. Now, on with the show.
Welcome to the show. We have Carol Shmygol with us today, and I just butchered her name as I was introducing her the first time. So, Carol, so glad to have you on the show. Welcome.
Thank you. Really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited. So we've worked together on the marketing board before. I know I met you even before that when you were at ATB. You've had a really great career and done a lot of different things. You were previously the SVP of brand and reputation at ATB Financial, which for anyone that's not in Alberta, Canada, that is.
It's a good distinction. Yeah,
it's a province in Canada. Yeah,
it's a province.
So it's one of the biggest banks in Alberta. It's a provincial government bank, I think. Is that how you would say it?
Yes.
Yeah. And has been around for 80 years and has gone through some remarkable changes over the last 15 years, I'd say, that I was here. If there's anything that's such a thing as an unbank, I would say that was probably the closest thing I've ever experienced to that. Previously, you spent quite a career in the agency side, working at Cassette, and you've been a marketing prof at one of the institutions here. So we're really excited to have you on the show talking about, in general, like lessons learned. We're super excited to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's preparing for today. And again, really appreciate the opportunity to talk. Preparing for today, it had me reflect back on a 35-year career that has just been, I've been really fortunate because it's been something that I've truly loved and been a huge part of who I am. So it's been a lovely walk down memory lane, getting ready to chat with you, gents.
Amazing.
I mean, this is one thing. V and I had a podcast for a while back where we talked about the career of marketing, how you get into it, and all that kind of stuff. And like, I went the natural route, which was going from science into
very
sales
natural,
and then into marketing. Yeah, natural route. So, was marketing something you always wanted to get into? Because I know you did have a bachelor in marketing. You studied marketing. Yeah.
Yeah. From an early age, I was always fascinated by marketing, and I can still recite back not just slogans and jingles, but lines from commercials. I don't know why, but what fascinated me was marketing is about persuading people. There's a psychology to it. And when you can use that ability to persuade people for the greater good, because of course you can use marketing for the greater evil and sell people stuff that they don't need. But it just fascinated me how it could influence behavior. Right. And so from an early age, I knew I was really fascinated by it. And in one of my first jobs at Cassette, I was working on a consumer packaged goods account, and we all did Myers-Briggs training at the same time. And Myers-Briggs was one of the main psychological profiling tools that you can use. And I'm an EFNJ, but the role that came back to me was you need to be in marketing. And nobody else in the room had that direct a connection between their Myers-Briggs result and what they were actually doing. So somewhere along the line, it's just inherently built into me.
That's incredible. That's incredible. Obviously, doing both agency and working, obviously for an FSI or, in the banking industry, you've led teams and managed teams for a very long time. I would love your take on this because I'm assuming like throughout your career, you mentioned, 35 years early on, probably a lot more male dominated than what it is today. Yeah. Can you kind of reflect on that period and what that was like kind of going up through the ranks, if you will?
Yeah, so I started my career back in 1988. So it wasn't Darren Stevens, and only a few people are going to know who I'm talking about. It wasn't Don Draper. It was after Don Draper. But it was, there was some positives about it, which is it was more fun and it was far more creative because there wasn't social media, there wasn't digital channels. And so the necessity to prove every penny ROI didn't exist. There was a lot of male dominance in the industry. But I've always been really blessed in my career in that there were a few very senior women, and this was at Cassette in Toronto at the time, that were forging paths forward. And so I was able to come up under them, and I don't feel that I suffered because of what the sexual orientation, especially in the industry, was at that time. It definitely existed, and there was a lot of cocaine, and there was a lot of affairs, and boardroom tables had to be kept pretty darn clean at the next morning. Like there was that went on that I heard about, that I didn't participate in, but I heard about. But I think that there's a couple of very strong women that I had an opportunity to come up under that really helped pave the way.
When we were prepping just for now, I'm just going to make a joke out of myself because I had said, now I'm reading the question. And it was, dating back to the Mad Men era, which was traditionally male dominated. I wasn't saying that you dated back to the Mad Men era. Just to clarify.
Okay. Well, I literally had to look up. Okay, so when did Mad Men happen? It was 1960 to 1970. And I thought, shit, I don't think I looked that old.
In my own defense.
Thanks, Mark.
I genuinely didn't mean it to read that way. I just want to call that out.
Okay, I feel better.
Yeah, sorry. Oh man. And then, I mean, cocaine aside, and whatever other products there were, is there, any advice now with the time and the perspective that you have, thinking back on your career, that you would have, like, advice that you would give to your younger self?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first thing that I would say to myself is be more confident in finding your voice.
Yeah.
I'm an introvert. I've always been an introvert, and I'm a shy introvert. So those two things aren't mutually exclusive. But I would often, especially at a more junior level, I would often sit around the table with an idea, being afraid to bring that idea forward. Like maybe it's a stupid idea. Maybe I don't get it, and everybody else is smarter. And then inevitably somebody else would bring up the same idea to applause. And so I would kick myself. So I think the first thing I would say is find your voice and your confidence. Like obviously respectfully, obviously don't shoot everything out of your mouth that comes to your mind, but be more on the side of being confident in finding that voice.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that I would say is love what you do and who you do it for. And I know that that's easy to say, like at the tail of my career. This whole phenomenon around quiet quitting really has me scratching my head. And quiet quitting, in my definition, is not work-life balance. Work-life balance is very important. Quiet quitting is mailing it in. It's doing as little as you can to still get a paycheck. And we spend far too much of our time either at work or thinking about work. And those people that say I can just leave it at the office, and I know the office is now in your home, that's bullshit.
Yeah.
It takes up way too much of your energy and your mind and your heart, that if you don't believe in who you're working for, the brand and the person, life is too short, and you're not doing yourself any favors, and you're certainly not doing your company any favors. And it should be a mutual, like a shared exchange of value between you and your company.
That resonates with me so much right now, actually. So thank you for sharing that, because I think at time we often forget, or we get lost in the remuneration packages, or sometimes the big lights of some of these larger organizations, where sometimes you start losing yourself in that. And I think it's important that you find that ability to kind of recenter and say, okay, what is it that I really want to contribute to an organization or a brand that I want to be passionate for? That, even if it comes into your personal life, it's okay, because you're giving it that, that ability to come in. So I think that's a very important takeaway.
It makes me sad. I've started to ask this question to some folks, which is right now, who really loves their job? And, COVID, the 2 to 3 years of COVID, I think we're all in a state of PTSD. And we've all navigated this from an emotional, a physical, a financial, spiritual perspective, and we've all come through it in different phases. And so I understand. I've never worked harder than I did in the last 2 years because of COVID. So there's deep fatigue there. So I understand how people are feeling. But at the end of the day, I want to love what I do. Because then I approach it with energy and with joy, and not with resentment and fatigue.
Yeah, that makes tons of sense. One of the great things about marketing, I think, that allows you to do that is that it's so, well, relatively speaking, a new discipline, but also always changing. And so, we were chatting a couple of weeks ago, Carol, when I saw you last, that about, the new technology. ChatGPT is like a lot of what everyone's talking about, probably is one of the things that's making being interesting for the first time.
I now use Edge again, by the way.
There you go. That says a lot.
What did you say?
I now use Edge as my main browser. So I've moved to the Microsoft product just because I'm curious to see and watch the evolution of the integration of OpenAI into the browsing experience. So I'm just immersing myself in it now more than ever before. So,
yeah. And so there's things like that on the technology side that have emerged and will always emerge, especially in marketing, that makes it interesting. I'm curious to hear about your thoughts on ChatGPT, but also it's just another in succession of, you mentioned before, where you didn't have social media before, and then there was a time when you did. And I mean, there's kind of this iteration of the new technology, the new thing, and it's going to kill off all these old things. And so I just wanted to kind of get your take on trends and talk about ChatGPT as an example of one of those things, and any other examples that you might have.
Sure. Maybe I'll start with trends because to your point, over the years, like the DVD, the VCR should have killed theaters, and yet theaters are doing wonderfully. Television should have killed radio, right? So I know I'm talking about traditional channels and traditional mediums, but there's always another shining thing, and it doesn't mean that it's going to change the world. And I have an interesting relationship with ChatGPT because I am intrigued and fascinated by it, and I'm scared as hell of it. I'm so lucky. Our kids, our young adult children, are 28 and 26 years old. They've gone through their university education. They are now working. But if I was a parent with kids in school all the way through, what I worry about is it's a shortcut to laziness. It is not misinformation. The risk of misinformation is huge, and it's what's it doing to critical thinking? It's really fascinating to me. I did an exercise with it, so I signed up to the beta test, and I did two things to test out the validity of it. And one was I was meeting with some colleagues that are both in between jobs right now, and they're both writing their resumes and their covering letters, and they're both overwhelmed by writing these things. Writing is a really intimidating thing, and trying to differentiate yourself. And so I went home that night on ChatGPT, and I put in maybe 6 bullets from my career, and I said, write me a covering letter. It wrote me a covering letter that I would grade a B. I would give it a 75%. But it was the bricks and mortar that I would then personalize and turn it into an A. And so it saved a lot of time in that regard. My other use case with it is I really want to write a murder mystery. I've never written a book. I will never write a marketing book. I want to write something that's so and I've never killed anybody. So it's really
I can't relate.
right. So I went into ChatGPT and I gave it 5 bullets of the idea that I'm thinking of. And I said, write me a story outline. And the outline it gave me was better than the outline I had written myself. So now I'm in a quandary. Like, why am I going to spend 250 hours? So I'm fascinated, and I'm really frightened by the technology.
Those are 2 great examples, in all honesty. And especially if you think about the cover letter example, where, you know what, the reality is it's not going to get you to that A+ or that 100% that you really need. But if you can reduce the amount of time, so if it were going to take you, let's just say, 2 hours to write a really concise, well-written, cover letter, if you can make that now 1 hour, because you've already built a foundation through, say, AI language, and now you're just spending some time tweaking the language, making it more personalized, is that not a win? Like in my opinion, I think it is. And I think if we learn to use this new technology in a way where we can reduce our time in some of these more mundane tasks, I think there's a lot of benefit there.
It's interesting. One of my favorite books is a book by Warren Berger, and it's called A More Beautiful Question. And it's based on the premise that our society has always rewarded and looked up to the people that have the answers. They're the smart ones in the room. And if I'm sitting at a boardroom table and I need to know, like, what was my share of voice, what was my sales, what were my engagement scores, all of this information. So instead of cramming my head full of that, every one of those answers is 2 clicks away on my computer. So why do I fill my head with that information? And then the book, A More Beautiful Question, talks about innovation has never come from having the answer. Innovation comes from having the right question, asking the questions. And so if a tool, and so it also says, I don't know if you have daughters, but at age 7, a girl will never ask more questions than she does at the age of 7 because she doesn't want to appear stupid, and our society has not rewarded people for having good questions. And so I think if AI and ChatGPT can help us for the greater good, do more critical thinking and spend our time asking the right questions, then it's a win. But of course there's a flip side to that, which is the laziness and the misinformation and the lack of critical thinking.
Sorry, Marc, I'm just so it's funny because I've been watching a few videos on how, some of these creators are actually, standing up websites literally by using ChatGPT. But the reality is they're developers and they know the right questions to ask the AI language to get the result that they're looking for. So that's where I think there's this misconception that it's just going to take over roles or it's going to take over positions because now you can just ask it to build something. The reality is you would only get it so far unless you didn't genuinely have the knowledge behind to ask the more informed questions that will get you to that end result that is probably, more widely accepted. So is it a disruption? Yes. But I think it will also accelerate the way, students and, practitioners actually start learning and become way more informed than they've ever been.
Just to kind of pick up on that other part of the question, like with the other shiny objects, I'm just curious, throughout your career, at one point, like digital was a new thing. Like you talked about TV killing radio and then digital killing all the other mediums and, social taking over. And now there's kind of like this swing back, it feels like in some ways, where all of a sudden we can't track everything that we used to. And everyone's like, what were we measuring before anyway? So I just wondered I wonder if you could kind of comment on that.
I was there for the advent of digital as we know digital today. And it's really interesting because you were either a digital person or a traditional person. And the digital people, they were the bright, shiny star. Like, oh my God, what are you talking about? TV? What do you like? Radio? Out of home? Really? We've got digital. And so there was always this battleground of one or the other. And I think where we've come to, I think, I listened to Tom Roach and the podcast that he did with you folks. And the right answer in my mind is a balance between the two, and they both serve a role. So is it brand or is it performance-based and tactical? Is it digital or is it traditional? And I find that the right answer, like if you think of a pendulum, the pendulum always swings too far one way or another, but when it achieves equilibrium, that's the sweet spot in my mind. So I do remember the battles, especially in my cassette days, fighting over, well, who gets the dollars? Well, it should be a digital solution. Well, no, it should be a traditional. Yeah. Well, digital is so much cheaper, and we can measure impressions. Well, that's bullshit. Biggest vanity metric that you can imagine. I don't really give a shit how many impressions. Sorry, am I allowed to swear?
You can swear as much as you fucking want.
So I've seen it all, and what I find now is it's the right integrated solution measured in the right way. That is usually the right answer. I mean, of course, it depends on the target. It depends on the product. But I do see a reemergence towards brand. And I think we're going to start talking about brand later in this discussion because it's something that I'm really passionate about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah,
I'm trying to bite my tongue right now.
It's so interesting. Because V and I, how we met.
Because I know you. Well, V, I think you are more.
Well, no. Because there's been a reckoning now for me. I have been more on the digital side, an awakening. Sorry. Yeah. Because I have, as a practitioner for the last 15 years, I've been very digitally focused. But I think through doing the podcast, talking to a lot of different thought leaders, working in different organizations, I'm starting to realize that it's not either or, it's how you complement the idea of marketing. And and one of my biggest gripes right now with a lot of organizations is the fact they insist on keeping these two disciplines separate. And that for me is a fundamental flaw of organizational design, and not finding a way to have them communicate under one idea of marketing. So yeah, I'm now on the other side of the fence here, where even though I made my money on the digital marketing side of things.
And V and I met actually, Carol, in that realm where we were both had joined Sport Check FGL Sports. Yeah. And so they had just gassed their traditional media department and replaced it entirely with digital people to try and be more relevant to today's consumers and so on and so forth. So we kind of were introduced to one another at that time, and both of us had channels that we were managing all digital, and a lot of it was performance optimized. So I think a lot of the times you get locked into the channel that you have, that you're a manager of, especially, and you begin to think that's what's right and what matters, as opposed to what's right for the business. And they don't necessarily meet in the middle. You know what I mean? Like the channel performance metrics don't always meet what the business metrics are.
Well, and then if I think about the agency world, if you have different divisions and one is digital and one is traditional, the fight for revenue in order to prove relevance and to grow the team. So Cossette always talked about integrated convergent communications, and they had it right a long time ago, even though I remember sitting in the boardrooms with battling for who gets the funds, but it shouldn't be one or the other. It should be the right answer for the task at hand. I think. Yeah,
completely agree.
I wanted to switch gears a little bit too, and just kind of talk about your career. I know we introduced you with having been educated as a marketer earlier on, and then progressing throughout your career and doing more executive education and certifications and so on and so forth, teaching, and then being a part of the Calgary Marketing Association and helping educate the marketing community and stuff. And so I know that you're passionate about that. And it's a sort of a funny thing. I find that we're a lot like me. I fell into marketing from science and sales. And so, but I found it weird that I would work with people that didn't really have formal training, and they were okay with it and wore it like a badge almost. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on fundamentals of marketing and how important it is to learn about that, and what fundamentals do you think are really important to learn?
Yeah, I think how you come by the learning is not important, but the fact that there is learning, and this is an art and a science, and there are fundamentals. So again, I don't care how you come by them, but don't shoot from the hip. Like there are fundamentals, and one of them is it's about how do you truly understand your consumer and what's relevant to them, and how do you relate to them. One of the fundamentals is, I think we're going to talk about writing briefs. How do you write a great brief? And a great brief has an insight, and an insight is a truth not yet told. And you can't be lazy, and you can't write 32 pages. You have to distill it down into something really powerful. And that is a fundamental that comes from being taught and from a lot of practice. One of the fundamentals is your ability to sell an idea. The greatest ideas in the world lie on the cutting room floor because you didn't know how to sell it, or who your audience was, or how to measure it. And I think maybe the biggest fundamental for me is when we talk about brand is not advertising, brand is not marketing. Brand is every single touch point that a consumer or a potential consumer or a stakeholder has with your product. It's not the ads. It's how you answer the phone. It's how you resolve issues for your clients. It's what your signage looks like. It's what your packaging looks like. It is how you treat your employees. And so when you can marry marketing and advertising with the actual experience that gets delivered, that is the power and the fundamental, because it's not about a really flashy, slick ad campaign. It is about bringing your brand to life in a way that truly speaks to who you are and delivers that in a relevant way. And I think that's probably what I get most excited about is the campaigns I've had a chance to work with over the years is when executives, the C-suite, the CEO understands that this has to be not advertising is the easy part of it. Advertising is finding a beautiful, creative way to tell the story. The harder part is aligning all of those other things in an organization so that what you say and what you do
consistent
to all your stakeholders, including your employees, are aligned.
There was speaking of which, it made me think there was an ATB campaign. Well, there's a bunch of them that I think were really interesting. And first of all, for people that don't know, you completely like reformatted the physical structure of a bank. Like I remember there's one on 17th Ave that you guys had renovated. You walk in and you would swear it was like a gallery maybe, or I don't know, coffee shop or something. Like it had no resemblance to what I thought was a traditional bank. And then there was a campaign that you ran around the same time where the phone number for the CEO was on the ad.
Yeah,
it's just different things like that. I'm like, wow. Like normally you'd be like, don't give them my phone number.
They might call.
Right, they might call. Well, it was the wrong phone number. No, I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding. So it's interesting. In my 26 years at ATB, maybe I shouldn't say this, or at Cassette, but I'm going to. The two clients in 26 years that I really did not like working with, one was a bank and one was a telco. And so we're going back 15, 20 years, and both of those industries were arrogant. They were risk adverse. They were greedy. They were not innovative. They did not care about a really good partnership with their agency. And so when I literally stumbled upon the opportunity at ATB, I took the job posting. I knew it was 26 years. It was time for a change. I took this job posting and I shared it with my husband, Mark, and I said, oh my God, this looks incredible. And he lovingly mansplained to me, well, Carol, they're a bank and you hate banks. And I said, no, they're not a bank. Read it again. They're a brand. They're an amazing, Rick's going to get pissed off at me. They're a brand. And I've never looked back, because banks traditionally, they have the persona of the caregiver. They sit in the taller chair. There's an arrogance to them and there's a greed to them. And ATB is a very successful, intelligent business that approaches things different. And maybe it's a sensibility that's been gained from being in Alberta for 80 years, when the Western banks, or the Eastern banks, were pulling out of Alberta because they didn't understand this market. This beautiful brand was built with a deep understanding of this province and who we are as a people. So I'm a huge fan of ATB, and they do things different. The Entrepreneur Center, the work that they did with our clients that were going through hell during COVID. We were the first institution in Canada to bring relief payments to customers working with the government. Like we just really legitimately care about our clients. And that doesn't mean that we're right all the time, and nor does it mean that we can help everybody, but there's a different sensibility to this beautiful brand.
I've had some people, close friends of mine that actually work for ATB. And one of the things that keeps coming up consistently is the idea of culture, and the culture at ATB, how there is this genuine care, and it really transcends and it comes right through to the front lines. And I think when you were talking about brand and where it lives and it's not advertising, I'm like, yes, keep going, Carol. That's exactly what Mark and I like to say all the time. And it's this idea of like, and maybe you can quickly talk about this, but the culture is almost like the catalyst to delivering great experiences. What are your thoughts on that?
It's 1,000%. It's the front line. That's where, as a customer, and the front line can be a website. Like I know very few people go into a bank. The front line can be a telephone interaction. But it's where the rubber hits the road and where the experience comes to life. And with what you're saying, either in recruitment for employees or what you're saying to potential clients, if those two things never the twain shall meet, right? If there's a disconnect. And it starts with culture, and it starts with how you treat your people. It has to be the same, because if you treat your people horribly, but you promise this wonderful customer experience, these people have to deliver that experience. And if they don't feel it themselves, they can't deliver it.
Mm-hmm.
Completely agree. Love that.
There's like a brand gap that you hear about a lot, or I hear about a lot because I look for it a lot. But there's like, the expectations, X number % of executives think we do an amazing job. They ask their customers, and it's like, well, man, that's so much.
Right.
And so that gap, I think a lot of time is, what we're doing, the check mark is that you think you're doing the ads, you've got great branding, it's consistent and those kinds of things. But that, to your point, isn't the same thing as the promise meeting the reality. And that has nothing to do with the advertising so much. It has to do with how the business is set up and structured, and how people are incentivized and all those kinds of things, trained.
Absolutely.
It's funny. We had Mary Kyriakidi from Kantar, global thought leader there, and she was talking about the nuance about advertising and its impact on brand. And literally, it's funny. The advertising is only responsible for about 20 to 25% of the brand building exercise. So when you, as a marketer, you hear that, and there's likely an overemphasis on the advertising side of things. It's like you can internally in your organization, you could probably influence a lot more things than just the advertising. And it's probably where you should be spending most of your time than trying to, make sure it is the, getting more pie for the advertising side of things.
Yeah. I think one of the best things that we did at ATB is full of brilliant bankers. And banking and marketing are very different.
Oil and water.
Banking and brand building are very different, right? It's very different. And so what we did in my early days, we had the opportunity to take the CEO and the C-suite. So I think there was 11 of them to the Cult Gathering in Banff.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have bankers who have never been, they've been to they laughed about all the conferences they'd been to, and never had they had such an innovative, unusual gift bag from a conference, from these banking conferences versus the Cult Gathering. But you have a room of the 11 most senior decision makers at ATB, understanding what brand was and listening to Jack Daniels and Levi's and the Dallas Cowboys and Brene Brown. And it was one of the smartest things that we did in my early days, because I would present and they would play back to me brandisms, which doesn't happen at a financial institution. So it was really awesome to get deep, loyal advocates for what our brand stands for and how to bring that to life.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, and that helps a lot when it's at the C-suite to get that buy-in there and finding whatever the means are. And in your case, it was that conference, but there may be other ways to do it. But I think that's such a smart idea. Talking about that brand gap, the other thing that we were talking in terms of the fundamentals, I just wanted to get your take on this, because I find this Better Briefs project fascinating. So there's also a gap in what marketers feel like they do well. Like if you ask any marketer who's written a brief, did you do a good job with that? Ask me, I'll tell you it was amazing. It was so good. It was the best brief I've ever written. I hand it over to my agency and they go, not so much. So, and you talked about briefs being really a fundamental part of a marketer's repertoire. And arguably, it might even be the most important document that sits in a marketer's briefcase, so to speak. In your experience, like what are some of the tips and tricks that you've had in writing briefs and communicating briefs?
Yeah, I think one of the pitfalls is if the client is writing the brief, what the client cares about is not what the consumer cares about. And the marketer's sensitivity or the agency sensitivity should be about really deeply understanding the competitive set and the client and what matters to them. And I think one of the pitfalls is putting everything in the kitchen sink that the author of the brief cares about, that the consumer cares nothing about. And I remember back in my one of the brands that I worked on at Cassette in my early days was Saturn automobiles. Don't exist anymore. It was produced by General Motors to combat the Asian import vehicles. It was a brand before I knew what a brand was. It was amazing. And, I remember the client brief, and it talked about catalytic converters and all this shit. And I'm not a car person. So lovely to be on a car account that was Saturn, but it's how do you, what you care about has got nothing to do with what the target necessarily cares about.
Right.
And it's really easy, it's great. It's easy to write a 1,000-page book. It's really hard to distill that down to 250 pages. That's palatable. If you listen to Terry O'Reilly, I'm a huge fan of Under the Influence, and Terry O'Reilly, and he tells the story, like, if you can condense things down, talks about Wired magazine. The brief for Wired magazine is, we want to make a magazine that feels like it's been mailed back from the future.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Like what does that tell you? Yeah.
It reminds me of that one with, I always butcher it, but the Coca-Cola bottle. Something like the brief there is like, smash it into 1,000 pieces and you can still identify it as a Coke bottle. Like that to me is what that Wired magazine one sounds like.
It's hard. One of the best briefs I wrote, like this goes way back. I was working on consumer packaged goods. It was Borden Catelli. It was Classico pasta sauce. When Classico pasta sauce was first launched, it was the first real premium mass marketed pasta sauce in all the grocery stores. And if another brand costs $2, Classico costs $5. And so the brief, the nugget of the brief for me was, I am Martha Stewart with a life. I would love to do what Martha Stewart does, but I don't have 16 hours to set a table. But if I can serve something that is Martha Stewart worthy, or like it's just, how do you distill it down? And then when you get it, you feel it in your gut that you got it.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like it, so it's the idea about the big idea, right? Like being able to centralize it and articulate an idea in a small amount of words. Like there's a real craft and an art to that.
Right. And so there's a few pitfalls. One is you have to be trained by somebody who does it beautifully, and you have to give yourself the luxury of time to do it. You can't do that in a half an hour. And maybe you only have a half an hour or an hour this week to write that brief. So how do you free up the white space? And maybe ChatGPT can take some of the mundane stuff off your plate to free up the white space so that you can write a really insightful, relevant brief.
So is, in your experience over the years, is there one kind of common pitfall that you have seen routinely on the briefs? Is it the way it's articulated? Is it the client trying to take on too much of the direction?
I think so. It doesn't matter the format. Is it one page? Is it 2 pages? Like I think that
not 10 though, probably.
No. But there isn't an insight. There is a laundry list of features, of features that are not differentiated and that really don't speak to why the consumer should care about it. I think that that's probably the biggest issue. When early days at Cassette again, I was charged with writing the brief to announce that a bank that I was working on was the principal sponsor of the Toronto Raptors. Toronto Raptors, brand new, city's all excited. It's amazing. Write the brief so that we can do this really slick campaign talking about the bank sponsoring the Raptors. And nobody could tell me, well, why did we sponsor them? Like, what is the purpose? What matters? And I remember Jack was the creative director at the time, and he said, Carol, this is the worst brief I've ever read. And I said, okay, but can you help me? And so we sat down as a team and we worked through it together because I didn't know what to say. Like I had no idea. So yeah, that was my claim to fame, the worst brief you've ever read.
Nowhere to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And do you find that there's a difference, like with you being on the brand side versus the agent side? Is there a different approach, or should it be, if it's based on an insight, it could come from either side? Does it really matter?
Yeah, it's interesting because at ATV we also have an internal agency. Like it was kind of the best of both worlds. Like I was client side, I was also agency side because it was an in-house agency, as opposed to the division that comes from a typical client agency relationship. I think that one of the fundamentals should be the relationship and the trust that you build between client and agency. And there's nothing wrong with sitting down and working through this together. And we can be the voice, the devil's advocate, which is consumers don't care about a catalytic, I still can't say it, a catalytic converter. But here, you know what I mean? So it doesn't have to be one or the other. It should be a partnership.
Yeah. In the brief writing process, it's a back and forth kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because as an agency, if you get a really horrible brief from a client and then you try to work through it, you're going to give them shitty work. Like, it's really hard not to. The hardest thing is when a client doesn't know what they want, but they'll know it when they see it.
Yeah.
I love the fact that you've
that's a tough one.
And I think what I love most about looking and understanding your career a little better is like you've sat on both sides, and I think it's really interesting. You don't have usually you have people that sit in agencies and they'll just make a career out of it, but you've entered and actually represented a brand. Is there any advice you would give both agencies and brands alike in how to navigate those spaces?
Yeah. I think that there's definitely strengths and weaknesses on sitting on both sides of that table. So, one of the things I loved about agency side is you don't get bored. You work on all kinds of different clients with all kinds of different team members. One of the things I love about working for a brand is that brand intimately. It's amazing. But with that, especially if you're creative, that might get tedious. That might get boring after a while. I think variety is great. So in 26 years at Cossette, that's a ridiculous long time. But anytime I would get bored, like it was a different account, it was a different city, it was a different role, it was a different team. And the same, we changed things a lot at ATB because of the pace at which society is moving. And so I think either side, don't let yourself get complacent and bored, and find a way in your business structure or in your strategy or in how you move people around to make sure that there is a freshness to their ideas.
I love that.
Yeah. Kind of building on this idea of like going from a brief to then, let's say, I want to kind of bridge the gap into strategy. So there's lots of things there that I would love to pick your brain on. But to build off of the brief, let's say I'm on the other end now. Let's say I'm on an agency side and I'm getting presented the brief or vice versa. So you're then faced with a choice of, like, to your point, you can say, I don't know if that's right, but I'll know it when I see it. I know what I like when I see it, kind of thing. That's a choice. Or you can tell people to work through something, as your other boss did, Jack. And often it's there's this also a pressure between doing things for the long term versus doing things now. And so I'm just wondering, from your perspective, marketers are super familiar with the pressure for delivering results today and versus the long term. And just wondering if you had any tips on how you could reconcile those situations that you're forced into, whether it's a creative approach that has to be redesigned, or if it's just like a strategic approach on how you're going to allocate resources and funds and that kind of thing, to balance those two demands.
Yeah, it's such a challenge. I know the agency world deeply. I know how competitive it is. I know how lean it is. I know right now how hard it is to find amazing talent, and clients are maybe more impatient. More impatient than ever. My philosophy was always, you are the client. I will always give you what I believe is right, but I will always still give you what you ask for. And the way that you can win the battle between give me an ad that has a car, that has a price point, and 32 dealer locations. Okay, well, yeah, but now let me give you what I think is right. And then let me rationalize why I think this is right. So when I worked on that other bank way back when, and we were tasked with doing an RRSP campaign, and they were so excited that they had 5 new mutual funds. So I went to IFIC, Investment Funds Institute of Canada, realized that 800 new funds had been launched that year, said, here's a campaign that talks about your new funds, but here's the facts, which is how consumers are inundated, and what if, and here is another approach. So you don't want to get into a battle of wills. Like, if I ask for a car ad with a price point and you don't give it to me, I'm getting pissed off because I am the client. But if you can find a way, and the trust and the relationship, to say, okay, this is what that looks like, but here is something different. And here's this isn't just my gut. Let me show you how many new funds have been launched in Canada. Let me show you what the competitive set is doing. So it's building the trust and the relationship with the client. It's not being the arrogant, I'm not going to give you that, because then why would I want to work with you as my client? Right. But it's through trust and building relationships and understanding that there is a short-term need to prove your value so you have a long-term relationship. So there is no right or wrong answer. I think it's just understanding, and it's empathy. It's understanding that both sides of this table have challenges and opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was just kind of trying to reflect on that a little bit, just thinking about, own experiences and whatnot. And I think the distinction that you made there is very important to get to that level where you can then have that trust and then start really kind of thinking outside that box. You have to establish some core, I guess, a core relationship there at the onset. And it might just mean delivering on what is being asked to build that confidence. But then, how do you can really kind of ramp that up at a later point to be, hey, there's another way of doing this. I hear you. We've already delivered on this. I hear you. And here's another thing that you can be considering. And I think that's the value that agencies can actually bring to clients, because sometimes, again, I think as clients, we can be very myopic because we just know what we know within our four walls in that moment. And that's what we believe is our truth.
Right. Yeah, I agree completely. And what you're super excited about as a client, what does the target care about? And how do you find that out? And oftentimes it's also going out and doing your own research. It's talking to clients, right? And so not using that research as a sword or a weapon, but using it to continue to build that trust and relationship. Wow, I'm really impressed you guys went the extra mile to deeply understand what consumers care about.
Mm-hmm. This might be like an obvious question just because you said the answer, but like, how important is research? Because it's what it seems to me like in marketing often gets cut when there's budget constrictions, but then within marketing, I feel like research is one of the first things that gets cut. Like, you know what I mean? And so I don't know if that's just been my experience in the different companies I've worked in, or if that's everywhere. But it also seems to me that everybody we talk to says research is one of the most important things, and so there's choices there to make.
I think it's the right research, right? So we talk about evidence-based decision making versus data-based decision making. I can find data to prove anything I want to prove, right? So it's what is the right research that carries merit and relevance with whoever the decision maker is. I think, I also think the other problem with research, it gets cut often because there's too much of it. Like there's 32 studies that I'm supposed to read every single month. And I don't know what the key points of this are. And they're often conflicting. So if you can find the right amount and credibility of research, I don't think it's going to get cut anymore. But right now, like I know so often, it's how do you weed through all of these studies? You can't. So you have way too much money if you can produce 32 reports a month and they conflict in information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair enough.
The next point here we had for you is it's really close to me because I've been on the receiving end a little bit of this, but the idea of constantly looking to react to competition. If we look at FSI, that's a very highly competitive industry versus really kind of charting your own path. Even though I feel like I have an idea of what your answer will be here, I'd love to get your thoughts on what is the right thing to do from a brand perspective when you're kind of looking at competitive landscape and then how you're positioning yourself within that or following, if you will, the competition.
Yeah, it's a really great question, and it depends. It depends on who you are as a brand. Can you even legitimately follow the competition? It depends on how relevant the competition is to your target market. It's really easy to pivot. Well, these guys are doing this, so we need to go that route. How do you understand your brand and what is relevant to your target? Because I mean, every adult in Canada, most adults in Canada use a bank. So who is your target and what's relevant to them? But it's also, I'm also a firm believer in staying the course maybe longer. Like you get bored with the work that you're doing. Our clients get bored. Like, haven't we been running that campaign for too long or that same strategy for too long? you have to give it a chance to break through to see what the impact and the results really are. If you're following your competition, you're following your competition. Where's the differentiation in that? What is your unique selling proposition?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, I worked in the airline industry, and that's why for me this was a really like top of mind question, because again, in Canada we really have two primary airlines that really serve most of the population, and it felt that we're constantly just chasing the big red machine, so to speak, right? And I think that's where sometimes you start losing yourself a little bit, and it's like, what is that from our perspective that we want to be doing differently? To have them kind of, recorrect. But there is a balance there. The reality is sometimes the market leaders are there because they are establishing, what is now norm. So if you can't offer the same product, the same services, then that could be a detriment to your, at the end, hey, your consumers or your guests alike.
Well, so regardless of your airline or what color you're flying, first and foremost, it's about safety. Secondly, I'm guessing, but then it's about reliability. And it's about comfort and price point, like depending on who your consumer is. So in a category like that, there's a lot of similarities between what consumers care about, regardless of who your specific target is.
Exactly.
So it's how do you knowing that these are the top four things that matter to consumers. Do we do more of the same that everybody else is doing? Or within that, do we legitimately have something different to stand on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
I could go into a whole rabbit hole here on this, but I'm biting my tongue.
There's another thought here, and I don't know how familiar you are with this, but you mentioned that you were listening to Tom, and I just found this this study or philosophy, let's call it, or a stance, a way of thinking that he brought up that I just want to touch base with you on. So he was talking about the UK is more predominantly based on the idea that marketing is a weak force. It nudges people, creates memories, that kind of thing. Whereas there's a general consensus or perception that in the US, or North America, marketing, specifically advertising, is more of a strong force, which is it'll bring a horse to water and it'll make it drink, so to speak. I think each one of those creates a perception of how marketing works and how advertising works. And I'm just wondering if you think, like, on your career, if you have any experience or like thoughts on which one might be more accurate, or are both of them accurate, or I just find this is an interesting kind of conversation.
And I think it's a fascinating discussion, and I think it depends. And I don't think that there's a right or a wrong answer. It depends on the brief. I can make advertising be a really strong force because it's a time-limited offer, it's a price point, it's a direct-to-consumer, it's very measurable. Mm-hmm. I can make advertising that is a weak nudge that builds familiarity with who we are as a brand and the beauty that you want to be associated with because we share values. It goes right back to what the brief was. What are you trying to accomplish? And what does the target think and feel about you? So I've always, just as it's not traditional and it's not digital, it's not brand and it's not tactical. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. And I deeply believe that it's a balance between the two. Like, I can get short-term sales easily by discounting my product and getting a ton of impressions out there. But that's a point in time. That's not building the long-term equity of the brand. So the brand build is a slower build, which takes results. And you have to measure the results in a different way than you would measure like what happened last month from a sales perspective. It's a slower build, but it's a really critical build, especially with this proliferation of choice that consumers have, with the how deeply consumers want to do business now with brands that share their values. Like, I think it depends, and the right answer tends to always be somewhere in the middle.
The answer is yes.
Marketers' favorite answers. It depends, and
I know.
It's new.
I'm a very definitive person, and heading into today, I thought I'm going to be saying this a lot, and it's the pendulum should sit somewhere in the middle.
100% though.
But I love it because it also makes there's camps too, which is not the right approach probably either. Like, it's not all one or all the other. Like, I think it's it depends. It's a spectrum, and there's somewhere in the middle of that spectrum that is probably the optimal answer. And so I think you don't always have to be forced to pick one or the other. You should just think about options about how you could blend.
I wonder, and this is maybe the contrarian in me, it's almost like you need those camps. You need those two sides to really be the opposite force to then find what that medium actually is. So maybe, I don't know, at least because it does give you that sense of like, well, I'm hearing you out here. Great. I'm hearing you out here on this other side. But at the same time, it's like, I think there's a blend here that we should be kind of focused on. So I don't know.
Carol, if you got 5 more minutes or so, I want to. Okay, good. We just wanted to ask about relationships.
Yeah.
One of the things, we tee off this with saying that like the CMO is the shortest tenure in the C-suite, and from you've, I'm sure, lived some of these experiences intimately, and so I just want to know from your perspective lessons learned in that setting too, in terms of building partnerships, building relationships. What relationships should marketers then think of investing in more, and just anything that you have any ideas and tips.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the CMO lifespan is 4.1 years. Like that's a really short lifespan. That's half of what a CEO lifespan is. And I think, starting, I think there's a few reasons for it. I think it's a really complicated job, and it's gotten ever more complicated in terms of the demands on the CMO and the expectations of marketing. I think it's really hard to demonstrate the value of the spend. Like whatever way you use to measure it is how do you truly prove the long-term value. I also think marketing is an art and a science. It's a left brain and it's a right brain. And most of the C-suite is not an art and a science. And my personal issue is that I also think everybody thinks that they're a marketer. I never thought that I was a banker. I never thought I was a car manufacturer, but it's really easy to think that you are a marketer. And that's a common...
I've seen it.
I watch TV, right? So I think there's a number of reasons for the shortness of that lifespan, but the relationships that have to be built. I mean, first of all, it's the CEO. The CEO is steering this ship, and they need to believe in what you're doing. And there's a fight for every dollar now, especially coming during the recession and coming after COVID. They have to believe in the value. I think it's really hard to demonstrate the ROI or the whatever way you use to measure the value, but having them understand having a way to measure it, having them understand and align to how you're measuring it. The CFO, the one that assigns the dollars, but I don't think it stops there. I think that marketing and brand and culture are deeply linked. Like I think it's a lot of work, but building the partnerships, not just at the boardroom table, but at the individuals and understanding what their sensitivities are. The sensitivities of the CFO is very different than the sensitivities of the chief people officer, right? So understanding and not manipulating your story, but understanding where they're coming from. And because I believe that brand is everything, demonstrating what this means to them. And that's a lot of work. The best thing that we did was take that C-suite to the cult gathering. So how do you educate them and get them excited about brand? This, we talk about at the agency world, we should be the funnest meeting our clients have all day long. We're talking about their brand. We're talking about creativity. So I think it's a lot of work, but it's absolutely worth it.
Do you think so when you think about, because you talked about the CFO, the CEO, and whatnot, building those relationships, do you think marketers should look to spend more time with a specific group to kind of get them more, in tune or become a part of the marketing process? Because I think that's what's sometimes missing is maybe the internal language too. But is there a group there internally that you feel like marketers should probably look to rub shoulders more with?
Yeah. It depends on the company, definitely the CFO, so that we become more than a line item. It depends on how the company is structured. But I think what's also an opportunity is how do marketers establish stronger business acumen so that we can speak like I don't want you to speak my brand language, but I need to speak your financial language. So it's also opening yourself up to having that level of developing acumen to understand, like if you can talk about what matters to the business and what the growth plans are and the role that you can play in that, like taking yourself maybe it's not only about building those relationships, but it's also about expanding your dialogue and your understanding of the business.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Actually, last year now, we had a guy, Dave
Bugs,
on, who is the CFO. Yeah, he's great. But it was almost like we were just peppering him with all kinds of questions. Like, what do you mean when you say EBITDA? Like, what do you mean when you say, days turnover? Like, and just like one thing after another, because I think that's kind of going back to the channel thing. You get so involved sometimes in the channels you're using. You get obsessed about the language there, but then you forget there's the business language that you have to be able to speak to people in, not just the channel language.
Yep.
And that most of the individuals internally speak, right? If you think about like the CEOs and whatnot, they don't speak marketing. They speak the business language. And I think as marketers, we're doing ourselves a disservice not spending enough time in that space.
So understanding what truly matters to each of these people, and hopefully it's the same. Hopefully there is a plan in place and they're all going in the same direction. There's some consistency and understanding, legitimizing the value that you play in achieving that plan.
Right.
Carol, what's next for you? I know you officially retired and you're writing some books with ChatGPT's help. You've got... There's some travel that you were talking about. Like, what's next for you in the next chapter?
It's a little bit of everything, and it's a journey and it's an adventure. And coming through COVID, the last 2 years were the hardest 2 years. And as a person who needs to love what they do, I thought, but what if? And we know our friend John, who so beautifully stepped into my ATB role. So I felt everything was taken care of. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit of everything. And I've had the opportunity to do, and I love traveling, to do some really interesting travel. I'm in Vancouver for a month, subletting our daughter's apartment. It really is. I love mentoring. I love staying really close to the industry. I will not write a marketing book. I will write a murder mystery. I just think that there's a lot of, I don't know what I have to say better than somebody, like maybe ChatGPT could help me, but then somebody else is already saying it. But it's doing things that I haven't done for the last 36 years. So it's a little bit of everything. And I'm kind of writing my own story as I go along the way.
That's probably the best way to approach it, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
Well, we are certainly glad that you made this a part of your chapter. And so this has been really awesome. It's great to have you on the show, Carol. Thank you.
It was a huge pleasure. And I was super excited because marketing will always be something I'm deeply passionate about. And I love the podcast and have thoroughly enjoyed the last hour chatting with you, gents.
Thank you very much.
V, you just started getting into it. Like, let me catch up. Hold on. First of all, let's do this.
Post-pod. Here we go. Yeah. Carol, I loved this conversation more than anything. It was something that, we have an opportunity to talk to so many different individuals, but now looking at it through the lens of a CMO, a practitioner, someone that's been in the industry for so long, and really trying to get that understanding of, what worked, what really didn't work, how things have evolved over time. I think it was just so refreshing to have such a very natural dialogue coming from a place of just curiosity more than anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to your point, she really has done a lot. I mean, her resume is so impressive, and the things that you don't know over that period of time, 35 years of being you don't see all the scars that she's acquired, and so we're benefiting from just the insights that she's had over that time. To say, you do it like this is great, but that might have taken her a year and a half to figure that one thing out. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's so great to have had her on.
Yeah, and I think this kind of dovetails perfectly into us. It's kind of thinking about, guess moving forward, doing a CMO series where we can kind of really start bringing more of these the practitioners into the podcast to kind of give our listeners this different lens as well, which I think can become incredibly valuable as we try to transition a lot of this stuff into our day-to-day operation as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the relationships thing for me was really interesting for a lot of reasons. And it's not like her point, it depends. And yes, the answer a lot of times, which is totally fair because it's hard to make a blanket statement. But relationships, I thought, was a really interesting point about, understanding the business language, like we've talked before with Dave, but, understanding it and being a part of that conversation with the CFO, with the CEO, with, I forget, there was different director of human resources, or she had a different language than HR, but it was, like understanding all of those executive positions and what is important to them, what motivates them. It's almost like doing customer research in a way, and sort of not changing your story, but like adapting your message maybe to the group and what is really important to them.
Honestly, and I love the fact that it comes up now more than often, this idea that, we do have to start thinking about our internal relationships more than just looking at the finance team as the one that hands over money. If you can understand how you can actually make a difference in the organization and work with them, you'll never be able to get that, that true buy-in that you're looking for. And I also loved that she used the cult gathering as a way to kind of help people, or I guess her leadership team, really understand some of the importance of brand and the importance of, being distinctive and et cetera. Such a great idea, especially for us here out west where you just drive to Banff. But, I think there's a lot of practitioners who do have some of those conferences that you can extend these leadership invites to, because at the end of the day, you need people in your, on your side, especially when it comes to saying why you need to continue to invest in the brand, or why you need to make sure that you're maintain that top of mind or mental availability. So I thought that was a really good takeaway as well.
Yeah, I think I agree. And there's also a flip side to that, which is if you're in an industry that does, I don't know, concrete or supply chain, or I don't know, name the whatever industry it is. Like, it also goes the other way, where you could go to some of these other conferences in those disciplines, in those fields, to get, firsthand experience with customers, or visit customers to begin with, but, go talk to the people that are in the thick of things, find out what makes them tick, what things are important to them. Like, I think there's an interesting opportunity to use the things that are common to every industry or common to every discipline within a business, and take the chance to learn something different that you hadn't before.
Well, and yes, 100% agree. And I think the conversation where it kind of went from there also was really understanding how organizations naturally, and because we talked about briefing, right? And I thought this was an interesting question that you had for her. And she made a comment that organizations rarely understand what the consumer actually needs, right? And usually, as a marketing department, you're the voice of the consumer internally. And if you haven't been able to kind of maintain that, what's the right word? That pulse, that's what leads to potentially poor briefing into the agency partners. And at the end of the day, agencies are looking there to support. But if you're not giving them the right tools to support you the right way, all too often it will result in maybe not a great campaign, whatnot, that will then be reflective internally at the leadership levels. Like, hey, well, you had this chance, you kind of failed. Now what?
Totally. Well, and I think we talked to Dan White about this. I think it was Dan, but there is a study that exists out there about, too many messages in an ad makes the ad more ineffective. And I think that comes from one of those briefs that has a long list of things that people didn't prioritize and choose to do less. You know what I mean? So it just becomes like this kitchen sink thing that you throw everything at. So there's this outward impact and potential waste from that. From that study that the Better Brief Project did, there's a huge amount of waste just because the brief is bad. It's just like, there's work to be done, and it's important work to spend the time, as Carol said, to trying to get down and distill all the stuff that we know about our company or our customers and products and into a single idea that can be clearly communicated. That takes work.
It's not easy, and nor should it be. If I'm being honest, like that is the value then at that point of the marketer. I'm sorry, like this is what you should be bringing to the organization, right? And I think when you look at it in the context of a brief, it's and I love the way that you positioned it around. It's probably the most important document in the briefcase. It is, because essentially it's you're taking the insights that you know about the organization or potentially what you know about the consumer or target market, whatever. And now you're trying to trying to use that to create a vehicle of communication for that end consumer. So it is probably 100% the most important thing that you will do in your day-to-day operation. And unfortunately, I don't think marketers spend enough time doing it the right way.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of that, I think, is because of the channel. Like we're talking about channels influencing our behavior and things like that. And so for years now, it's all been about short form content, snappy, bite-sized, snackable, whatever, like snippets. And yet you've got like people that still go to the movies that are 3 hours long. And so, to assume that people don't have an attention span. And so you need just like 18 million little tiny things as opposed to one big thing, I think is a miss.
I agree. If you remember when we were talking to John Mowat about this, like good content is good content. And if it's good content, that people are going to consume it, full stop. It has nothing to do with the duration or anything like that. And sometimes as marketers, like, you'll submit a creative brief and, agency comes back and it's just so good. I remember actually it was during my time at the airline where the creative brief went in, the creative agency came back with a banger. Like it was literally such an amazing piece of work that we opted to change our media strategy because of the content being so good. So we were looking for the bite-sized, snackable, etc. But it's like, we can't do that. So pivot. We need to pivot in that moment. And I think having that awareness to say when you do have the right content that you're able to pivot, I think is incredibly important, versus just trying to listen to your Facebooks, your Googles and be like, no, it needs to be 2 seconds or whatever. And make sure you show the logos up front and the back and you have enough color and blah, 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 blah. Nah, sorry. That doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
What else stood out for you?
I was just going to say the other thing I thought was interesting about reacting to competition. Like, I thought that was an interesting perspective. Because if you're not doing your own thing, then by default, you're just being undifferentiated and being me too. So I thought that was interesting and I would imagine that takes a fair bit of courage to be able to say, wait.
Yeah.
Like, we don't need to do something right now, even though there might be, and maybe that's also one of those it depends kind of moments. But there's probably moments where there's a pressure, but there's not really a need to change. In other cases, there might be a need to change and a pressure. And so that's when you make that choice. But I don't think the default should be just because somebody else is doing it, we have to do it too.
Honestly, I love that question so much because it is probably the one thing when you think about marketing, like you have a category that you're representing and you're working within the confines of the competition that's there. And you'll always want to have a pulse on the competition. Don't get me wrong. But the biggest way to demoralize a workforce or the people that are working in a discipline like marketing is to say, well, just look at what our competition is doing and lose sight of what we are and what we do. It's such a difficult balance to have because sometimes you have competition that is actually innovating, pushing that needle, and it can be used as a point of reference. But there's other times where you're now starting to deviate away from what you are as a brand. And there's such a gray area in there. And it's easy think about like your executive leadership suite to be like, oh my goodness, Tom's ABC just launched this and we're not even thinking about that. What are we doing wrong? Why can't we be more like Tom's ABC, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
It's the last thing any marketer wants to hear.
Yeah. Is there anything that last thoughts that you had that kind of stuck out?
I think this may be something that a lot of people will kind of it will resonate with, but being better storytellers. And I think we've talked about this a few times, but in all honesty, for being marketers, I think we do a very poor job of storytelling internally. And it was great to hear Carol's take on this as well. And, I think she positioned it as one thing she would tell herself, is like finding her voice earlier, but then also finding that way to kind of really tell that story or tell those ideas. And I think all too often we do maybe retreat a little bit and we leave floor to other departments, or, maybe it's finance or our other peers, where we should be a little bit more bullish, maybe bullish is not the right word, but like owning the moment, confident, and know that we can be part of the strategic decisions of an organization, but you do need to find a way to storytell in a way that makes it palatable, but also it can resonate across the different leaders that you're speaking to. So I thought that for me was like was just another reinforcing of like, got to be better here. We have to be better. How about you?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I thought that, because that was one of the first things that she talked about was, lessons learned about thinking back and advice to give to herself. I thought that was really good. I mean, we all probably doubt ourselves. And I don't know that that's marketing even, but people in general. And I think it's just good advice for anybody thinking back on their career, but especially in marketing. We're the voice of the customer, and people may not always, but a lot of times we're voice of the customer. And so, or at least voice of the market, maybe is a better way to say that. And so I think we have to take more pride in the things that we have access to and the knowledge of, to make sure that it's, and say it confidently, because if we don't say it confidently, then nobody's going to believe it.
And let's not forget, and I think she reiterated this as well. It's, if you think about marketing, or when you think about brand and its impact across the organization, I think that's something also sometimes we lose sight of. And we just keep seeing the fancy ads. That becomes our calling. And it's unfortunate because it's not just that. I didn't want to add more time because we already had, spent an hour with her, but I wanted to talk to her a little bit about like organizational design, because I do know ATB doesn't have brand inside of marketing. And I think it's an interesting thing and it actually sits under, I think, customer and people or something like that internally. So it's a completely different way. It doesn't sit under any sort of commercial function and whatnot. It sits outside. And I think that's important when you're thinking about, how do you actually impact all these other touch points? You can't just do it by sitting inside of marketing, right? Or advertising, where it's just a vehicle. It's
somewhat liberating too, to think that way, because, I think there's a lot of pressure on marketing to fix the brand.
Yeah.
When the answer to, bring up Mary's stat again, if 75% of the brand equity is built through experience and only 25 through marketing ads, then there's a lot of opportunity for us to go, hey, we can fix a couple of things on our end, but maybe we should look at, say, customer service, or maybe we should look at the product design, or we should, there's all kinds of things that were maybe misattributed to being the result of a marketing department, and should be spread out more evenly across other business units.
I 100% agree. And maybe one thing, at least that, that I'm seeing, is sometimes having, marketers are going to hate me for saying this, but maybe sometimes maybe we have too much money, right? And it forces us to not think about what other areas we could be influencing. It's like, we're just going to throw money at the problem. Bigger, better, more creative, whatever, where it's like, maybe it's not just that. because again, if your brand equity is being built in 5% outside of the ad, man, like that's community outreach. That is a million different things that it could possibly be. But we keep fixating on one part of it, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Dude.
V.
It's amazing.
It's a good show.
It was great. And it was great doing one
awesome.
in our own time zone, by the way. Can we shout out there? We were all three of us were in this.
Shout out to the Mountain Time Zone.
It's incredible. Amazing, man.
Awesome, man. Great. Well, until next time.
This was great.
Yeah.
Idea.
We'll talk soon.
Take care.